And our third group that's going to be speaking, and they can share screen and put their presentation on the Zoom for us, is Hamid Moeiniasl and Laura Taylor. Hamid's a good friend of mine, and I want you to know he is the reason that everything is going well technically here. He's really quite amazing. The second year in a row to put it all together, this conference. So Hamid, are you ready? You and Laura? Wonderful. Whenever you're set. And I'm going to introduce your topic. The topic title is called Assessing the Critical Thinking Skills of English Language Learners in a First-Year Psychology Course. And the floor is yours, Hamid and Laura.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. I concur with you. Hamid is a pretty excellent person and a joy to work with. So our presentation today is part of a larger project that we're working on with other scholars across a wide range of fields. So, before I get started, I'd like to give credit to Jeff Graham, and Michael DeBraga, Will Huggan, and Tanya Marchand, who are also part of this fantastic project. So let's get started. So Hamid, can you advance? So in terms of what we're doing here today, we thought we'd start out by just sort of explaining to you the impetus for this project. And that's sort of the fact that in our Canadian context, student populations are becoming increasingly diverse. And so incoming students are coming from a wide variety of cultural and language backgrounds. And this type of diversity in the university settings is generally viewed as a positive aspect in tertiary education. But there's still concern among educators and researchers that English language learners lack the critical thinking skills that their English as a first language, so their L1 peers, are able to demonstrate. And so a few things to note here. So we're identifying ELLs, English language learners, as students who have English as an additional language, meaning their first language is a language other than English and regardless of their country of origin. And then because there are concerns over critical thinking, more broadly, this can lead to questions on student readiness for university over the duration of a course or student chances at success. So it is our opinion that critical thinking skills are necessary for university, but also for students' journeys beyond graduation. And so therefore students that lack critical thinking can face detrimental consequences in the longer term. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of looking at the previous research on critical thinking, our motive for carrying out this project is based on some of the challenges that we saw beforehand. So there's this notion that among faculty, that English language learners are unable to demonstrate a level of critical thinking that's consistent with their first language peers, and that in the first place, first language students generally don't have very good critical thinking skills. And so this doesn't just stem from, our own personal experiences, but it's sort of understood among the wider university community. And so several studies have sort of attempted to document the lack of critical thinking skills of English language learners in Western contexts. But many of these studies really only focus on students' written work, and they identify one particular ELL-associated nationality for investigation. And so we felt like there was more to critical thinking than just students' sort of ability to write well. And so to sort of assess these presuppositions that faculty have towards critical thinking skills and ELL students, and to see if these were appropriately justified, we tried to look at a more diverse group of ELL students and try to assess critical thinking through a reading and response task instead of a typical writing assignment. Next slide, please. So in the previous research studies that didn't focus on writing, the way that critical thinking was assessed is sort of a standardized rubric. So scholars who focused on ELL research generally suggested that these standardized tests are disproportionately negative towards English language learners because there's suggestions that the language proficiency required for these standardized assessments is problematic. And so it was our assumption that by using academic language that specifically matched the discipline-specific language used in the course, the issues with language proficiency would be less of an issue. And of course, we needed a baseline score using a validated instrument. So we chose to investigate critical thinking skills of the students enrolled in a psychology course, which included L1 speakers and ELL students. And so we used a standardized assessment that was that already existed in the literature, and then we designed our own subject-specific one. And so we thought that such a research design could demonstrate a further contribution to knowledge in the area of critical thinking skills. So this sort of leads us to our research questions. And so these are the ones that we created for this English language learner version of critical thinking. And that includes, how do students from different language backgrounds self-assess their reading ability? And Hamid will get into that later when talking about methodology. Our second question was, are there any disadvantages for English language learning students in relation to psychology-specific critical thinking skills? And so if yes, are these ELL students able to overcome these disadvantages by the end of a full year psychology course? And then finally, to what extent do English language learning students differ from L1 students of English in terms of their generic CT skills measured by the Watson-Glaser practice test, which is that standardized rubric I was talking about earlier. And again, Hamid will get into more details of these later on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before we could start to develop something that was appropriate for testing psychology-specific critical thinking, we had to figure out what critical thinking was in the first place. And basically what we discovered from the research was that there was no consensus on the definition of critical thinking. So we have sort of this broad definition provided by Halpern that you can see on the slide. And he sort of endeavors to encapsulate critical thinking, saying, it's the kind of thinking involved in solving problems, formulating inferences, calculating likelihoods, and making decisions. Critical thinkers use these skills appropriately without prompting, and it's usually with conscious intent in a variety of different settings. And so that was a nice starting point for us, certainly. But then we looked at something slightly more recent from Dwyer, Hogan, and Stewart, and they sort of suggested that critical thinking is a metacognitive process comprising several subdomains, several subskills, things like analysis, evaluation, and inference. And so based on this, critical thinking for our university context is broadly understood to contain the ability to assess and apply evidence as a means to analyze or support an argument. And this in turn requires students to evaluate the credibility of information. It's also probably helpful for us to look at what the literature said about why students don't generally have good critical thinking skills. And so there are a number of different reasons. I talked briefly earlier about language proficiency, which anecdotally from my position at UTM, I see as an issue for my ELL students in our context. We're aware that the ability to use English can be a challenge for some students, and that's regardless of whether or not, despite their admission to university. There's also this notion of cognitive load theory, which suggests that using a different language overtaxes the cognitive resources so that there's not enough capacity to apply critical thinking when language is an issue. But not all researchers agree. So there are some that feel that language proficiency isn't really an issue when it comes to critical thinking. So just like with the definition of critical thinking, there's just really a lack of consensus on what causes some students to lack these skills. And so if we look at the research that sort of goes beyond claiming about language proficiency, we can see other suggestions as to why critical thinking might not be great among English language learners. So this might include aspects of culture. So in some cultures, there's not a need to engage critically with the literature. Published literature is seen as top quality, and therefore students are not encouraged to question it. This aligns broadly with collectivism, where the group is more important than the individual. And so this level of certainty is often referred to as cognitive conservatism. And so we see this largely in research related to East Asian students, but it's not solely for East Asian students. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Hamid now to take you through the methodology.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Thank you very much indeed for your nice presentation. Already enjoyed it. Thanks everyone for attending this session. My name is Hamid. I'm doing my PhD in OIZ. This is, in fact, a snapshot of the project Laura Taylor, Professor Laura Taylor, Professor Michael de Brugge, Professor Jeffrey Graham, and Professor Will Hagen did in the UTM. Okay, now let's just talk about the methodology. Okay, first of all, I'd like to just tell you a bit more about the participants. To seek the answer, in fact, to our research questions, we recruited participants who were enrolled in a first-year psychology course at the psychology department of UTM for the 2019-2020 academic year. Based on a series of, in fact, academic questions, including their English language background, especially participants were divided or assigned to 3 different groups. The first group was those who had English as their first language, about 361 students. So the second group were those who had English as an additional language, but who had completed at least 4 years of high school in Canada. And the last group was those who had English as an additional language with less than 4 years of staying in Canada or studying in high school in Canada. The rationale behind, in fact, dividing these students into separate groups was to reflect the different types of ELL students enrolled in the university. As the participants were in fact students in a course, they were assigned a variety of tasks and assessments over the year-long course in assessing their CT. There were 3 elements of interest. These included 1, Form A of a computerized psychology-specific CT assessment, drawing upon the Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking Appraisal 1994 version. In term 1, but also in term 2, we administered the Form B of the same test, and also a Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking Practice test. Participants completed each task through an online format.
Recently, PhD researcher.
Pardon me? Yeah, okay, as I was saying, the tests were administered through an online format lecture tutor in the university computer lab, where the students' progress was monitored by the TAs and also some assistant or helpers. The Watson-Glaser Thinking Assessment Practice Test comprised 34 items and was implemented as a means to assess the criteria related validity of our self-designed psychology-specific C-test. The Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking Practice Test was also used to investigate to what extent students' English proficiency level may influence the performance on a general C-test as opposed to our own psychology-specific C-test. Now it comes us to the, let me just tell you a bit more about the psychology-specific C-test. We developed our psychology-specific C-test exclusively for the purpose of this study. We designed the questions in a way to mirror the same subdomains in the Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking test, but with a psychology focus, using topics from the students' in fact course textbooks. Each of the 2 tests contained 12 questions divided into subdomains, as you see here: recognizing of assumptions, interpretation, evaluation of arguments, strengthening or weakening arguments, and also deduction, and finally assessment of inferences. In total, in 2 forms A and B, we had 24 questions, and they were presented in multiple choice format to the students. Prior to the beginning of this assessment, we introduced our participants to the definition of each of the 6 sub-scales, along with a series of examples during a presentation in class. As you see in table 1, the total score of the students on the psychology-specific C-test Form A and Form B were calculated in this study to determine the correlations between psychology-specific C-tests Form A and Form B and the Watson-Glaser practice test and midterm tests among 3 language groups. We were interested in investigating how different language groups perform on the psychology-specific C-test Form A and Form B and Watson-Glaser practical test. As I said earlier, our 3 language groups consisted of Canada-born English speakers, non-English speakers who stayed in Canada more than 4 years, and non-English speakers who were staying in Canada less than 4 years and identified as international students or who have to take the English proficiency test, IELTS or TOEFL as part of their admission requirements. The results show that, okay, hold on a sec, okay, yeah. Yeah, the results fortunately show that there was a high correlation, as you see, among these, in fact, our own tests. Hold on, sorry. Okay, I guess, yeah. Sorry, let me check this one. Okay. So fortunately, the results show that these 3 images were significantly correlated with each other across the 3 language groups. And it was kind of, for sure, for us surprising. But as you see in the table 2, we were looking to find out the answer to our next research question. We had to run one way, and you know what, on the scores in both Form A and B. A quick look at the results of ANOVA table shows that in the first, in fact, term, the difference among the students' scores on Form A across the 3 different language backgrounds were statistically significant. In the first term, there were significant differences between the L1 English group and the other 2 groups at p-value 0.05. However, there were no significant differences across these 3 language groups in the second term on their scores on Form B. I mean, in Form B, although the differences were quite marginal, but they were not significant. In other words, non-English speakers who completed high school in Canada and ELLs had lower scores on the Form A of the psychology-specific critical thinking test, but these differences were trending down in Form B in the second term. Difference in students' performance, a psychology-specific C-test might be related to lower level of English proficiency of international or immigrant students compared with their native English speaking counterpart. As CT task, it, as Laura mentioned, cognitively overload these students. Now, let me just tell you a bit about the discussion section of our research. Therefore, as it is also claimed by some researchers, English proficiency accounts for ELL learners' poorer performance in CT tests. Different scholars have attempted to explain ELL's low performance in CT tests compared with their L1 peers. One of these explanations, in fact, has to do with the similar process of increased cognitive overload that also is responsible for ELL students' lower performance in solving mathematical problems. The reason is that, according to the cognitive load theory, only a limited chunk of information can be held and processed in working memory at one time due to limited cognitive processing resources. ELL students have to use some of their limited working memory capacity to processing the information related to the less familiar language. Such a demand on their mental resources eventually overtax their working memory and it prevents them from efficiently processing information related to the task itself. Along the same line of reasoning, Lund et al. Suggests that CT task presents ELL learners with similar problems when the CT tasks are in English as a result of heavier cognitive processing load. The results also, so as you see here, there's also suggests that ELL students, fortunately, in the end of the academic year, could narrow down their gap with their peers, especially the English is, I mean, students who speak English as a first language. And the result might be because students were able to bridge the gap because they were engaged in lots of reading assignments and writing assignments. And also, as some other what scholars also suggest, students might be able to improve their critical thinking over the course, although they were not explicitly taught, CTS skills. Okay, that brings us to the implication of the study. Okay, I'm going to finish quite soon, no worries. So, due to their low language proficiency, ELA learners might find tasks requiring them to use CT demanding and undesirable. However, given the fast-growing number of ELL students in colleges and universities in which English is the medium of instruction, cultivating CT in university education should be implemented by technology-assisted education. Because as you know, it is not possible in large-size classes for the teachers to interact on a one-on-one basis with students in order to improve their critical thinking. So in order to help the teachers or instructors, technology can step in and help them save the time and energy, at the same time have provide the students with one-on-one feedback. This is especially valuable, especially as I told you, in large freshman classes where the instructor may not have the necessary even resources to regularly interact on a one-on-one basis with the students, and hence is unable to examine the deeper understanding that is essential for subject mastery. But computerized CT assessment provides them with a tool to integrate critical thinking into a curriculum without taking much of their class time. We also suggest that instructors need to provide their ELL students with some linguistic services to facilitate their CT development. Instructors can recruit the potentials and affordances of technology-assisted education with the aim of lessening the cognitive complexity of a critical thinking test. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, please type in the chat box, or if it's 1 or 2 minutes, okay, please unmute yourself and start asking the question.
Thank you